Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the illusion of inclusion. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about racism, ethnicity, and discrimination at the 21st century, Dr. E. Kelly Sanford. Dr. Sanford is a professor at Tennessee State University. And Dr. Sanford, let me welcome you to the show this morning and tell you how delighted we are to have you here to talk about what I consider to be a very, very important topic. And I think it's a topic that it's your title, your topic, and all of that. And so we want to talk about, as you indicated, the illusion of inclusion, you see, and the persistence of racism and discrimination in the 21st century. And let's have you to begin that by giving us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll get into the illusion of inclusion.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haynes. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. I am, again, E. Kelly Sanford, professor of Tennessee State University, Department of Sociology. My earlier background, my postdoc was at Penn State in State College, Pennsylvania, where I dealt with the elderly. Prior to that, I was at, and very proud of, Howard University in Washington, D.C., where I did my PhD, my doctorate degree. There, it was very much related to the homeless. And I was very proud to work with those inequalities that exist within our society and looking at homelessness. My undergraduate degree is at North Carolina Central University and North Carolina in North Carolina. University of North Carolina, as well as North Carolina Central University. There I looked at student motivation, student retention at historically African-American universities. And again, I'm very proud to be here again today to talk about this issue of the illusion of inclusion.
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, you've been with us before, as you've indicated, and as I've indicated on a number of occasions. But now, to begin this topic, the illusion of inclusion, it sort of bring us into your mindset in reference to this as a topic this morning.
Yeah, it is. And I want to try to start by stating the problem. As our viewers sit here and see us, as we think in terms of your viewers on this wonderful program that you have, we're all very fortunate that race relations in America has indeed changed. I think many of us just looking would have never thought that we would have a President Obama that would hold the presidency of the United States. We can think of how things were when things by law were segregated. Schools were segregated, places where ethnic groups could not even go and eat were segregated, could not go to movie theaters, things were segregated. But over time, with the civil rights movement, as we're talking about the 50th year of the 1965-64 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts that have changed laws, that have made things pretty much equal. Hopefully for us as racial and ethnic groups have an opportunity to have equal opportunity to jobs, to local places that you need to go to eat, to live, to purchase things. Our children now have another type of opportunity that were very unequal in the past because of segregation and discrimination that existed. But presently, we have those laws that give different racial ethnic groups opportunities. And those opportunities are present within our society. And I think many of us can really name it by the mere fact that we are here today on this television program. Gives us this idea that there's this type of freedom that we have, that we're unfeathered, if you will, by laws that kept us and prevented us from having certain type of equal opportunity. However, when we look at the economic disparities today, when we look at certain urban areas today, we still see places that are segregated. When we look at job opportunities, they're still unequal. These types of situations has still very much related to race and ethnicity in the 21st century. Therefore, I try to bring this attention to the illusion of inclusion, because we have a lot of people born in the 90s that feel this freedom, but still may not see the persistence of race and ethnicity and gender, if you want to put that in there, in today's society. And it's a very topical issue for us to be able to realize. And we have to spend focus on it as a problem that still exists and continues within our society today. So race, when you think of it, is really a fundamental part of our social structure, of our institutions that make up society, such as family, such as economics, such as the military, such as health, such as science. all of the major institutions, such as government and politics, still very much a part of an institutionalized way that race and ethnicity still persists.
It still persists even in the 21st century. Of course, Dr. Sandberg, let us take this first commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll develop this topic later. And let me encourage our audience to that we'll be back with you following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the illusion of inclusion, and Dr. Sanford has given us some excellent information during the first segment concerning his background, education, and some of his experiences. But Dr. Sanford, now you left off dealing with some of the aspects of where we were and where we are now in terms of race, ethnicity, and discrimination. But now let's see if we can pick up at that point during this second segment and have you to sort of develop that aspect for us.
Okay,
the institutionalized thing for
Absolutely, because race is still fundamentally a part of our social structure, of all of the institutions that make up our society today. Although all of us know about the past, 244 years of enslavement, 81 years of Jim Crow laws leading into a civil rights movement that we talked about at the opening of the segment, we still see that ethnicity, race, gender, those types of issues still persist. Profiling for minorities such as Arabs, such as Asians, such as African Americans, people that are migrating here today. Immigration is a very topical issue presently in our society today. And people are still discriminated based on those type of perceived or alleged types of characteristics that make up race. The traditional aspect of it has always been these physical characteristics, these things that people just look in a certain way, and people then have stereotypes based on that. And as a result of that, a lot of younger people today feel like that everything is free, that they're not experiencing it anymore. They have the opportunity to go wherever they want to go. But when we look at the economics of it and economic disparities, health disparities, when we look at issues such as openness to be able to go into certain areas of study. It might perceive to be free and open. However, when we look at who is actually entering, we see quite disparities today based on race and ethnicity. So in many instances, this is still a real complex problem that we have today. And one of the reasons I wanted to open it up this time, because we've talked about this a number of times, because many people will say, well, no, I haven't experienced that this week, or I haven't experienced that. I live in an upper class neighborhood. I'm driving around in this type of car or that type of car. But when we look at the real sense of those that live in poverty in America, it's still disproportionately based on race. That's why it's such a fundamental part of our social structure, our society, because it's still very present. We have a certain small percentage of those who are minorities that seep out of it, but by and large, the larger percentages are still very much present in so-called low-income ghetto areas today. That's causing high crime rates in certain areas of our cities, not only urban but rural presently in our society today. Even when we look at our beloved state that we live in, we will see disproportionate amount of those who are in low income that have high infant mortality rates, who are African American, 12% roughly in this state. Some developing countries have less than that. And here we are, and race still matters.
And so this illusion of inclusion. Now, how are we to react to all of that? I mean,
Well, the illusion is simply we have this false sense of reality that everything is just fine. While we might have that sense that it's fine, because we can have a freedom to go any and everywhere we want to go, we have to be very serious about, well, to what degree when I go there can I participate in this freedom? Do I have I got equal access to it, but can I go and actually be a purchaser of that? Now, I have this sense that I can go to any school that I want to go to, but have my economics place me in a position to let my child go and participate in that private school that's $15,000 a year for first grade or not? Or to be able to take advantages of certain extra workshops and programs for my children so they can develop? Or do I have the extra money to be able to do that? Now, when we look at health and health care, which I'm so proud of, you're talking about this illusion of inclusion, we can still see, and President Obama has had the Affordable Care Act, and you can see the backlash that was there up front. And we can see that it's worked. Over 7 million plus signed up for it. So many of those people were in very much need of health care. Not only that, some of the policies that are linked to it, such as if you had certain types of ailments prior to the ailment, they would say, well, your insurance would have said, well, nope, you cannot have assistance as a result of that. This is help. Who did this help? Not the rich, but the average person out there that's in
everybody.
need. Therefore, the illusion of inclusion. Sometimes we can be a professor or have a talk show and start thinking that, well, everything is just fine. But then as soon as you go and find out what something happened 10 years ago, and now we can't satisfy that today, well, who is that going to hurt? That's not going to hurt a wealthy person. That's going to hurt the average working, the illusion of inclusion. So I think that policy has helped. When we see on the international news that the president met the Pope, first thing they were talking about was this notion of international and national poverty. So there's this idea on our last segment that when we talked the last time I was here, this whole idea of helping those in urban areas that are still economically in need. So the environment and the culture, that is the culture of poverty that is present still within our society, impact those that are developing within that culture. Now, although we always talk about race and ethnicity and gender, our poor European American brothers and sisters are in that same economic category, have some of those same types of outcomes as well. So this idea of illusion of inclusion includes everyone, that everyone is in need of certain types of help programs that will help people in the future. So I think this is a very important topic for us to realize that we are part of the larger system as well.
Very good. Now, you know, when you reflect on some of the challenges that we have in trying to overcome this whole idea, how do you see us working in order to make some of these ideas that we're talking about realities in the 21st century, make them for real?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but we're thinking
not
in terms
an illusion, but to make them real. What do we do in reference to that?
It's kind of like the issue of the complexity of it. A multi-pronged problem has to have a multi-pronged type of solution.
Good.
So the idea that this race and ethnicity is still so fundamentally embedded in our institutions, our same institutions need to recognize that this is indeed a problem. That's the complexity of it.
Not only is it a racial problem, but it's also an institutional problem,
right.
And we probably won't be able to solve it unless we first deal with what? The institutions. Is that what we're suggesting
That's
here?
Exactly. Well, further suggestion from many of our earlier segments that racism is institutionalized within our society that we live in. So we have to recognize that. And we can only do something about it to help heal it by, say, in our educational systems doing something about it, within our health systems doing something about it, with our economic systems being fair, as we can see that certain policies are trying to be changed today.
Okay, Doctor, let's take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
again, you know, college level, to do maybe touch on it.
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Professor Kelly Sanford from Tennessee State University, and the topic is the illusion of inclusion, the persistence of racism, discrimination, and ethnicity in the 21st century. And he's given us some excellent information dealing with some of the aspects of this as a problem within our institutions. And so, Doctor, let's see if we can pick up and have you to not only continue talking about the illusion, but help us to come around to what we might be able to do dealing with this as an issue.
Okay. Yeah, and as we said on the last segment, I think it's all institutionalized. For instance, one of our other main institutions that make up the social structure of society in which we live in is that of law, government, and politics. So when we think in terms of law, we're thinking about how those within disparities, within low-income areas are disproportionately in prison, for instance, than others. Here in the United States, the most developed, highly industrialized, richest country in the world, where we have over 2 million people in prison, over 200 million in prison.
More than anybody in the world.
More than anyone in the world. I'm sorry, 200 million in prison. I think Russia has 680,000. And we are having, you know, millions of people that are in prison. We need to do something about that. This is one of the problems of the false sense of identity, of how we need to try to bring some solutions to that problem. And it's certainly connected to another institution, that of economics. Economics is connected, of course, to the family. In those low-income areas where you have teenagers having babies, where you're having breakups within the family without parental type of assistance. All of these things are just causal factors that's related to some of the larger problems that we have in the society in which we live in. Although those same people, as we refer to as having this illusion of inclusion, are feeling this certain sense of freedom that moved out of the 60s movement to let them feel, well, I can go in a place, but now we have to work on the educational development, work on both families being there, work on people being motivated, having a desire and attitude about, which we will know, which many of the younger audience will not know about, just the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And in elementary, junior high, high school, preparing them for the universities to be able to cognitively think in a way of learning and being able to then develop themselves for the social structure of society in which we're living in. Those fundamental basic things are still very important for success. And I think everyone could have an opportunity to do that. That's why we started off the entire segment today by saying, look at us. You know, race is changing. But when we were there, we had to go with thinking that it hadn't changed, that the worst was there, and we developed and improved. So now, every opportunity is there, but we still need to focus on those still basic educational processes that helps you to develop and to prepare for the larger society in which we're living in.
And so in a real, in a real sense, each generation has to indeed push forward some of the ideas that we developed after the Civil War, and that generation pushed us a little farther, and now the 60s pushed us farther. And now you're saying that this is the time for a new understanding of where we are and to move forward from that particular perspective. Is that what we're suggesting?
That's exactly what we said. Charles C. McIntyre has a book that's entitled Racializing a Race, Criminalizing a Race. And in there she talks about how during slavery, many people were institutionalized into prisons. Now we look at Michelle Alexander's book entitled The New Jim Crow, where we still have these millions of people who are in prison, 2 million strong, and mostly are disproportionately African American and other minorities. So how do we look at sentencing within our institution of the law to say that some people who might have a very limited amount of something that is indeed illegal, but are placed in prison for a long period of time, and when they get out, are stigmatized by that, maybe when they were teenagers, of having 3 pieces of crack cocaine, or some marijuana, and then presently stand in and then can't get out and have their voting rights again, cannot get equal access to job opportunities, so therefore will have a recidivism rate of re-entering prison because of trying to make ends meet within the system that has gone forth.
What impact does this have on the ability of Africans to vote, to get out and participate in the suffrage? And during the last few minutes that we have here, let's make some statements in reference to how this might be overcome if we were to become more involved in voting and the suffrage and et cetera. Make some statements in reference to that.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like to say here in the Davidson County part of Tennessee, with that Michelle Alexander's book, there's been a group of us that's been meeting, and we've talked about this issue on when many get out, they do not have that right to vote again. And that's been very impactful. They are indeed citizens of the United States, the Constitution, but they lose that as they've gone in. And so many judges and lawyers that even attended these sessions felt that they needed to be changed. But given the present legislation under those particular laws right now, they are kind of forced, although they might morally feel that it's wrong, are forced to look at those guidelines and then act accordingly. So this has really been detrimental. But I would like to say, out of those that are actually have the right to vote, we need to go out and then exercise that right and go out to the polls, because you got so many. I think we talked about a statistic earlier, out of the percentage of people in a particular county, only a very small percentage, maybe 6%, are actually utilizing their vote, while those, as you may very well know, during the civil rights movement or prior to that, out of slavery, out of the Civil War, fought very hard to have the right to go and have a vote. And now people will not exercise that right. So we need to have a strong push to go out and not be so caught up into this false sense of fairness, that everything is going to be righteous for people. That's that illusion of inclusion that we're trying to bring it back to as we're closing, to think that we have to go out and exercise that right to vote, but also understand those other institutionalized things that we have to make sure that we are part of the process too. Taking advantage of education, taking advantage of economic opportunity, workshops, those types of things to improve the society in which we're living in.
And so in a real sense, there's an opportunity that we still have to make things better and make these illusions real, a reality of the illusions that we have. And so you think that the best way to do that is through political participation. That's sort of a mass kind of thing that you can get a large number of individuals involved in, and you can see almost immediate results simply because those who participate in the suffrage are such a small number that the only thing that it would take is for us to have some kind of commitment and get a large number of folks involved, and that we might be able to change some of the things that you're suggesting. Is that what we're saying here?
That's exactly what we're saying, but I think even more so how complex it is, because people have this sense that everything is okay. That's why I won't go out and do it. While when we were growing up and others of your viewers were growing up, when we didn't have that opportunity, we felt a sense of need. We had this collective consciousness about trying to overcome. Now people feel that they have already overcome and everything is just fine. So some type of way, there's this push that's strongly needed to get people very much involved again with their kids as they are growing up, to understand that race is still fundamentally a part of social structure, although we've come up with different categories of other. Politically, that other can take away from some of the rights and privileges that females would have as well as others would have. And I would like to be able to say as well, and as we look back on this, sometimes it can get a sense that we're always bringing this issue up centered around race and those types of things, but it's really improved the society in which we live in. Let's look at it very concretely. President Lyndon Baines Johnson helped out with the Civil Rights Act. They made it open and free for everybody to have some type of opportunity. President Obama has done an excellent job, and we have to also think that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was very fundamental in that civil rights movement, those that were involved and the unsung heroes and sheroes that were participants in it to bring about change in our community here, as well as throughout the United States, as well as the world. Even with females that have these opportunities, sometimes we take for granted that they have opportunities to participate in sports. That came out of the civil rights movement with Title IX. No one at places just gave that right to them. People had to fight for them. And so this is very fundamental. But it goes back to how we have to still realize that we have to understand those rights and work, because race is still prevalent.
Final statement. Do you think that change would be good for America?
Absolutely. Change is good, and it's happened. It just has to continue to happen.
Very good. And of course, let me thank you for giving us that excellent information. And let me encourage you to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.
do is tuck all the cables.
Okay.
And see, your clip is right here.
Okay. How about?
Do you have a jacket pocket? I mean, the pocket. Yeah, here we go. That's what I'm looking
Okay.
for. There we go. You are going to be fine. After all this fidgeting, it will be fine.
I guess without notes, I don't really need my
No, you don't need
glasses. So I won't need my glasses.
what we're going to do. It's a 30-minute show.
Mm.
All right. The first segment is 6 minutes. And it's
The
just,
director said go ahead and close your jacket.
Okay.
the first segment is 6 minutes. All right. And during that first segment, we're going to talk about background, education, and experience.
Okay.
Now that'll be 6 minutes. And what you do, you look at me,
Okay.
and don't move your chair. See, because thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is professional wrestling in the South. And we have with us to talk about professional wrestling in the South, Professor Robert Pickard, a professor at Tennessee State University who has agreed to give us some information relative to the wrestling in the South, but from an historical point of view. And of course, let me welcome you, Professor Pickard, to the show this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Honey. It's always great to be with you.
And to tell you how delighted we are to have you here with us this morning. You've been with us on a number of occasions, and each time you bring us such excellent information, and we anticipate that today. But before we get into dealing with professional wrestling in the South, Professor Pickard, let's have you to give us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of your experiences that made you interested in the topic that we're dealing with this morning. Then we'll talk about the topic during that second segment.
Right. I was born and raised in Nashville, and I grew up here, went to public schools, to Stokes Elementary, West End High School, and then Hillsborough High School, then to MTSU, and was always interested in history and always interested in politics. I had a kind of a political background. Went to graduate school after MTSU up in Michigan, and then later at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., got my MPA there. And then throughout time, I spent a lot of time out of the area. I was, well, first out of the country. I was in the Peace Corps for 2 years, and then I worked in refugee programs in Asia and Africa. And I did some political work and also continued doing some refugee and development work while I was in Washington. And moved back to Nashville in 1994, worked for the local government here for a number of years. My wife is still working in the local government. And I began teaching part-time at MTSU about 12 years ago, and moved on to, I taught there for 5 years, and I've taught at Tennessee State since 2007, and at Nashville State Community College for 4 years, I believe, since fall, or I think January 2011. Taught at Motlow State for a while as well. So I've taught at several colleges in this area. And I've written a number of op-ed pieces for the Tennessean, as well as some things, some articles for the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. And I'm working on some articles now for the new Encyclopedia of Nashville. It's a brand new online encyclopedia. Wrestling is one of those topics. Popular culture, also politics and foreign policy are all my interests, and international affairs, human rights, civil rights. These are all things that I think, although they sound kind of disparate, I think they come together very well, and they do in this topic of wrestling. When I was a kid, of course, I watched wrestling on television, locally produced wrestling. Nick Goulas was a promoter. And it took me a while to, like most kids, children are usually, young people 10 to 12 years old are usually an audience for wrestling. And I kind of lost interest after a while. But then when I was in college in the 70s, one of my best friends, history major at MTSU, was a professional wrestler named Joe Rossi, who went as Joey Rossi. We favored each other, looked a lot alike. If I'd exercised then like I did now, we could have probably been a tag team because everybody thought it was his brother. And Joey's father was a legend in this area, Lynn Rossi. I wanted him to come with me today, but he unfortunately had some medical things to take care of, so he couldn't be with us today. But he was one of the greats. He's in Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. Lynn Rossi was what is called in the trade a hooker or a shooter. A hooker or a shooter is somebody who has real wrestling skills. A lot of people who go into wrestling are not wrestlers, but he could wrestle. He could wrestle in the Olympics. He could wrestle in a street match. He could wrestle in what's called a shoot match in wrestling, which is where instead of that's something that's scripted or they make up as they go along, they actually are wrestling. And so I would travel a lot with Joe, and I would also, he would get me tickets, free tickets for the Wednesday night show. And so that's how I became interested in wrestling initially, and nobody was writing. And today, you know, at that time, wrestling was kind of seen as kind of low class or entertainment or, how would you say it, lowbrow entertainment. And today it's big business. And we have TNA Wrestling, for example, here in Nashville. It's a national promotion.
And so in a real sense, you bring to us today not only some information in reference to wrestling itself, but the history of it, that, excuse me, that you can put it within the framework and show how significant it was and people who participated in it. And those are the kind of things that I know that you have for us today. And so I want to take this first commercial break, and then we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is professional wrestling in the South, and we have with us to talk about professional wrestling in the South, Professor Robert Pickard from Tennessee State University, who has given us some excellent information in reference to how he became involved in such a topic. And so, Pickard, let's see if we might pick up at this particular point and to sort of look at the historical development of the art that we're talking about today. Right. And I think you've already indicated that it has been lowbrow and et cetera, but I think it has come to the level now of being able to, let's talk about it from that perspective.
Absolutely. Professional or wrestling in general is the world's oldest sport. Every ancient society has a tradition of wrestling everywhere in the world. And the only sport that comes close is foot racing. And you think about it, wrestling is kind of a natural thing. I mean, probably everybody's been in some sort of wrestling match, even just a friendly little scuffle in their life. And of course, we have lots of metaphors that deal with wrestling with your conscience and so forth. And so for as long as it's been done for money. The ancient Greeks, of course, in the Olympics, they wrestled for money, and it was a very rough sport too. They went out and broke bones. It was to the end, basically. They didn't have that many rules. And you also had boxing, which was about kind of a cousin of wrestling, and you had something at that time called pancration, which was what we would today call mixed martial arts, which was basically just an out-and-out brawl with no rules. And they were paid. They were professional athletes. Now, move up to something like the Roman Games. And we think about the Roman Games as being fights to the death, and they really weren't. The fights between humans were not. Sometimes there would be fights between humans and animals, and those were to the death. And you had fights that were well, not fights, but public executions. They executed people in very horrifying forms during the games. And then you would have the fights between humans, and those usually weren't to the death. You could just hold up your index finger and it would be over. And these were professional people. Many were slaves, but even if they were freed, they would still fight. They'd fight 2 or 3 times a year, make a lot of money, have a lot of female admirers. And another thing, as old as the sport is, as wrestling or any of these other kind of similar sports are, women have always participated. The textbook we use at TSU talks about Spartan women training for childbirth, basically. They prepare for childbirth by playing sports, including wrestling. And in fact, the textbook says, and these are the exact quote from the textbook, they wrestled in tunics that other Greek women were found immodest. And so, female wrestling was thought as kind of for titillation, but so was really for male. A friend of mine described pro wrestling as a male soap opera, and I would add to that it's sort of kind of a female strip show, because women, by the 1950s, about 60% of the audience was women. Now, in our times, of course, it came over from England, from Europe, and going back to colonial times, there were taverns that would sponsor wrestling contests and catch as can. They basically had all kinds of styles of wrestling. 8 of our presidents were wrestlers at one time, and many of them for money. I'm not sure about Washington. Washington did wrestle. I'm not sure if he did for money, probably. But most prominently, Abraham Lincoln, our most revered president, wrestled in over 300 matches, most of them for money. So you might say it's accurate to say he was a professional wrestler.
Who would have thought it? But
right.
Go on, yes.
During the Civil War, of course, like in all wars, men are not always engaged in combat, so their superior officers organized sports. One was the newest sport, baseball at the time, but the one was the oldest sport, and the New England style kind of caught on around the country. And after that, there would be pro wrestling contests. By the turn of the century, pro wrestling was a legitimate sport, but it got kind of dull because men would get each other in headlocks, and they would have headlocks that go on for hours, and people were just dull. They were bored by this. And at about the same time, you had these carnival attraction shows called shows. And they would feature these carnival hucksters would have wrestlers, and they'd say things like, well, we got a wrestler here, he'll take on anybody in the audience. A guy would say, hey, I'll wrestle that guy, a local guy, and it turns out he's actually a wrestler, and they're working together to produce an exciting show. Now, at the turn of the teens, there were all kinds of what were called hippodroming scandals, which meant that all sports were rigged. Just about all. You had scandals. You had the great Say It Ain't So, Joe scandal in 1919. Horse races were rigged. Everything was rigged. Boxing particularly. During the 1920s, you had Jack Dempsey had all these grudge matches, and wrestling got the grudge match idea from boxing. Wrestling just kind of stayed that way, and in the 1920s, these carnival show types, people like Jack Pfeffer, who was an immigrant, Jewish immigrant from Poland, came in and just turned it into the show. They were selling entertainment. And they would hire people who were not wrestlers, people like football players or guys who were just handsome. And of course, women's wrestling, there would be a women's match, just like in ancient gladiatorial contests. It would usually be fights between wives of senators there. So, and you'd have midgets and all these other things coming. And two major things came along. One is the concept of heels versus baby faces. Baby faces were the heroes. The heels were the villains, the bad guys.
The heels versus
baby faces, or sometimes they just call them the faces. And then the other was a tag team contest, initially called Australian Tag Team. Now, they would usually, the tag team contests, who'd have some outside interference, someone come in, hit somebody with a chair or whatever, and set up things for a grudge match for the next week. And everybody get a big show and they got their money's worth. Now, wrestling almost died out during World War II. Women kind of carried on wrestling then, and then they died out. But then 1950s, we have this new kid on the block called television. And the networks want time, but regular sports, it was difficult to show on television at that time, like baseball and so forth. So wrestling became big, and boxing. Each network, there were 4 networks at the time, and all of them had 2-hour wrestling shows and 2-hour boxing shows. And usually the wrestling shows would always have a women's match. They were real popular. 1957 or so, that died out, and it went to the local promotions. Promoters were divided with local territories. Nick Goulas, who was a native of Birmingham, Alabama, grew up in a Greek section there, became the promoter in Nashville, and he had Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, part of Indiana.
Very good. Let's stop it here for our final commercial break, Pickard, and then we'll come back and allow you to start at the professional aspect of it during the last part of this show. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Okay.
Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Professor Robert Pickard from Tennessee State University, and he's given us some information about professional wrestling in the South. He's already given us some very, very good information dealing with a good background to get you into what we call, Professor Pickard, professional wrestling in the South, and the impact that this sport had upon the population at the period.
Right. Now, as I said, they moved to local promotions there and local television. And our local, it was Channel 8 at the time, it's now Channel 2, had the first local wrestling show sponsored by Nick Goulas, paid for by Harold L. Shire, who owned a jewelry store downtown. And they developed their own star. Basically, Saturday afternoon wrestling was an infomercial, the first infomercial, and they'd usually have some dastardly deed by the heel would come in and hit somebody with the head or whatever, and they had announced a big grudge match on Tuesday night or Wednesday night in Nashville, and they had the same grudge matches in Louisville and Chattanooga and so forth. You had, Goulas had some people who became legends. Jackie Fargo, whose real name was well, I'll think of it in a minute, but Harold Faggart. Can you imagine growing up with a name like Harold Faggart? No wonder he changed it to Jackie Fargo. Tojo Yamamoto, who
I remember Tojo.
Tojo was actually an American from Hawaii, been a Marine in World War II, but he played the awful, horrible, bad guy, Banzai, and so forth. And then the great Lynn Rossi, my friend. Now, Lynn Rossi was in a tradition of the shooter or the hooker. People could actually wrestle, and they would always be the champions. The promoters wanted these people as champions because there was a big match back in the 1920s. A very good wrestler was supposed to lose, and he got tired of this, so he just double-crossed and won the match when he wasn't supposed to. So Lou Thez, probably the greatest American wrestler of all time, kind of epitomized this, and Lynn Rossi epitomized this. And so Lynn Rossi became a major star. He was champion for 7 years until he had an accident in 1972. His son, of course, was my good friend. 1963, they needed to deal with this idea of integration. The audience fans at that time, people who made up the largest part of the audience were the very young, the very old, minorities, and blue-collar workers. Blacks, as I'm sure you know, were segregated off into separate but unequal sections. There were some wrestlers just like this. One of the heels, Gorilla Monsoon, was outspoken against this. Here are some of our best fans. We're putting them in the worst seating. And bad guys, the heels would come out as part of their act. They would go out and blow kisses to the black section, which would get everybody mad. Well, Lynn had an idea. Let's take this. You had blacks in matches, but they were in separate, segregated matches. Let's have an integrated match, and let's do it in, of all places, Birmingham. And I don't have to tell you how Birmingham was in 1963. It was just civil war there.
It was civil rights then.
Civil war and civil rights. I mean, people were traveling around with guns and so forth. So in classic fashion, Lynn Rossi got into trouble in a wrestling match on Saturday television, and two guys were beating him up, and Bearcat Brown comes out to intervene in the match. They announced a big grudge match on Monday night in Birmingham.
Bearcat Brown was this black
right,
man.
he's a black wrestler.
Yeah, good.
And that was his real name, by the way. And so as soon as they announced the match, the Ku Klux Klan made a death threat, said they were going to bomb the stadium. And they went ahead with the match. They knew that they were going to bomb a stadium full of white people and black people, but they were everybody's a little nervous. One of the wrestlers, Saul Weingroff, said to Gulas that night, said, "Nick, you're a Greek, I'm a Jew, Tojo's a Jap, Lynn's Italian, Bearcat's a Negro. There's no way they're not going to bomb us." But in fact, the match came off, and Bearcat and Rossi became major stars all over the South. They toured every county in Alabama. They went all over Kentucky in years. And then after Lynn had his accident, he worked with, Bearcat teamed with Joey Rossi, and they were big stars. So somebody told me after I wrote that article that was in the Tennessean about this, one of my colleagues at Nashville State came up to me and said, "You know, I saw your article there, and I grew up in South Carolina, and they said they brought the black wrestlers in as war heroes. They made them war heroes, and that's how they brought them in. And eventually, when it was a sign of progress for black wrestlers to be the heels, to be the bad guys." I wanted to tell you one thing. I've become a fan recently of a wrestler, and I don't follow wrestling a whole lot these days, but I found one that is very much in the tradition of Lou Thez and Lynn Rossi. And she is a woman. Her name is Sarah Stock. She's from Winnipeg in Canada. She works primarily in Mexico and Japan, and is like a household word there. She is very popular. She has a Canadian maple leaf. They call her Sarah la Canadienne. She worked for TNA based in Nashville as Sarita, and she is just immensely popular, and she is very good. She can pull off all these stunts and maneuvers. I wish we could bring it up. I could show you here, but she can pull all these kinds of stunts and maneuvers that excite the audience. But I wouldn't bet against her in an Olympic wrestling match or a street fight with a Marine. She is very good. She trains every day. Very intelligent woman, a prep school graduate with a degree from the University of Manitoba in chemistry, which I'm sure you agree is not the easiest subject in any College of Arts and Sciences. and trains every day. So she's someone I would look for, and I would hope that we'd see on TNA again or on the WWE, the big promotions. Goulas basically sold his promotion. He had competition from Jerry Jarrett, one of his former wrestlers, and from Jerry Lawler, another former wrestler, started and took Memphis away from him, his biggest town. And of course, you're familiar with the story of Andy Kaufman and his series of matches out there at Memphis. So Goulas sold out in 1980, retired, and then the big promotions came in and knocked out the local promotions. The WWE came along, or WWF it was called, run by this one family, McMahon's in New York. And I'm kind of rooting in a way for TNA because they're a local promotion and they're fighting against this big monopoly up there. So I hope they do well. I found out today, I called them and found out that Jarrett is no longer with TNA, who founded it. He's founding a new company that was in the paper the other day, Global Wrestling. So I wish him well.
Now, don't you think that they're making a media comeback? Because I think that more folks are, I see more announcements in reference to wrestling now than I've seen in a long time.
Yeah, when you were growing up and I was growing up, wrestling was lowbrow entertainment. Everybody said, oh, this is fake. And, you know, there were just some, but they'd had an audience and people didn't make money. Now it's big, major business. And you've got, I'm sure there are other shooters and hookers other than Sarah Stock out there. There are others who are good wrestlers and good performers. And I've been fortunate in my research to get to know some. Lorenzo Parenti died just recently, worked for Goulas for many years. I never met Jackie Fargo. I did meet Don Green, who owned a furniture store here in Nashville and several furniture stores, and was a total workaholic. I don't think man slept because he wrestled and worked for the as a guard in the jail and had 4 furniture stores. I met Cora and Debbie Combs, who both were women wrestlers who were very popular around the country. And I met Rick Martel many years ago, who became big with the WWF in the 1980s. All good people. You meet wrestlers, and of course they're like everybody else. You have some good and some bad, but most of the people I've met are, even if their persona is to be the heel, they are basically good people. You got to kind of take their stories with a grain of salt, because sometimes they'll tell you
They've got a lot of stories to tell.
They got a lot of stories, and some of them are just like with anybody else. Some of them are fantasy, but it's an interesting story, and wrestling is a story. It's like my friend said, a male soap opera, and I'll say a female strip show too.
And it's a story within itself. I think, as you've demonstrated here today, that it's very, very important, and it's something that we might see and never really reflect upon how it got to be where it is. And I think that you've given us an excellent idea in terms of where we are now in reference to the sport.
Let me recommend a good book. There's a history of professional wrestling. I meant to look up the author's name. I forgot, but we've got it at the TSU library. It's called Ringside, and there's a good film called Lipstick and Dynamite, which is a history. It's a documentary on women in wrestling.
Very good. And let me thank you for bringing that excellent information to us, Professor Pickard. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is overcoming the barriers of foster care. Overcoming the barriers of foster care. And of course, we have with us to talk about overcoming the barriers of foster care, Pastor Kay Walker, and with Pastor Kay Walker is Miss Brenda Redmond and Miss Karen Sparks. And of course, let me welcome you, Pastor Walker, to the show this morning, as well as Ms. Redmond and Ms. Sparks. And I stumbled when we came out of the gate here, primarily because I was not sure whether we were talking about foster care or child care. I think we talk about all of these different topics. But of course, you've been with us and you've given us quite a lot of information. And I think you have with you two persons today to talk about some of the barriers in child care. Foster care, why don't you give us some information about the two of them, and then they'll be able to give us some short statements in reference to their background, education, and whatnot, and then we'll come back in that second segment and we'll start off with foster care. Let's start off from that perspective.
Okay, Dr. Haney, first of all, thank you for allowing us to come on your show and talk about some issues that I think are very important, some things that I found out recently through talking to one of the guests here, Ms. Brenda Redmond, about foster care and what happens to children after they come out of foster care. So I'm here, with them to talk with you about this, and let our audience know what's really going on in the foster care system and what happens with the youth after they leave out of that system. And we have Ms. Brenda Redmond. She's here. She's the founder and the executive director, and then she has Miss Karen Sparks here with her as well. So I just want to let them tell you a little bit about themselves, because I think they know more about themselves than I do.
Okay, well, Mr. Redmond, let's start off with you, and let's have you to give us some statements in reference to your background, education, and experiences. And Ms. Sparks will do essentially the same thing, and we'll be out of this first 6-minute segment, and then we can get into foster care.
Okay, my name is Brenda Redmond, and thank you again for having us on your show. My name is Brenda Redmond, and I am the executive director and founder of Starting Point Project Incorporated. We are a career, educational, and vocational service for youth that have exited the foster or are exiting the foster care system. I hold an undergraduate degree from Indiana University in history. I have a graduate certificate in nonprofit management, and I also have a master's degree from Trevecca in education. This program was essentially founded to be a bridge and a gap in services to youth that that needs a little extra arm and a leg when they exit the foster care system.
Ms. Sparks, what about you, Ms. Karen Sparks?
Yes, I'm Mrs. Karen Sparks, and I'm happy to be here as well. And I'm a native Nashvilleian. I was educated in Metro Public Schools, a graduate of Tennessee State University and Trevecca Nazarene University. And I've been an educator in Metro Public Schools for 35 years. And I became interested in being a board member of Starting Point Project, Inc. through my friend and former co-worker, Brenda Redmond. And I am on the board, as I said, and also I'm over the hospitality program that we hope to have up and running very soon. And
let's start with Mr. Redmond here, because I want to ask in terms of when we talk about foster care, Ms. Redmond, what does that mean? I mean, how does a person become involved in foster care, and sort of trace that information on up for us on up through for the rest of this segment? Talk about it from that perspective.
Well, as far as the kids are concerned, most likely kids come into foster care of not of their own fault. Even with that in mind, a lot of the children need foster parents to help bring them through. Okay, a lot of times some people are involved in foster care, might not wish to continue with foster care after the child makes 18 years old or the child does not become adopted. And so that's when they have a difficult time between the ages of 18 and 24 navigating what will be a smooth transition into adulthood with a bumpy road, and that's where we hope to come in at.
And so a foster child, foster parents are people who take in children.
Yeah, foster parents are people who take in children that are not of their own in order to give the child some type of shelter to help them in the situation as if it was their own child. What we would like to see with children in the foster care system, that they would be able to be stable and placed with one family, a family that would help them transition from the time that they're adopted until the time that they leave foster care after 18. But of course, as we stated again, that sometimes is not happening. And that's where we come in to try to assist.
And so today what we want to talk about and what we're talking about are some of the barriers that many of these children or adults face following foster care. And what we're going to do, we're going to take our first commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Okay.
Sort of give us a review in terms of that kind of information.
How they get
I know
in.
how I got involved in it.
I mean, that's what we're doing. I mean, we're talking about you and then
Okay.
Ms. Sparks. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking about foster care and some of the barriers that young people face and older folks as well face once they come out of foster care. And Ms. Redmond has given us some excellent information, as has Ms. Sparks. And so let's see, Ms. Redmond, if we can look at the organization that you're in charge of, Starting Point, and tell us give us some information in reference to how you became involved in that organization and what are your objectives and how successful you've been. And then we'll allow Ms. Sparks to give us some information in reference to what the Metropolitan Public School System is doing in reference to foster care. And then we'll have Pastor Walker to sort of summarize from his perspective some of the things that the two of you have been talking about dealing with foster care, and we'll get out of this second segment.
Okay.
And let's start with you at Starting Point.
Okay, Starting Point, the idea of Starting Point was born out of a necessity of youth exiting out of foster care. I was teaching at a well-known program that houses state youth, and I was teaching GED skills. And within that program, there were kids that were exiting foster care that were really, some of them were becoming homeless. And the program is a great program, but personally, as a teacher, I knew those youth, and they would ask me things like, can they keep clothing or backpacks or whatever in my classroom, because they had to go and stay at a hotel, or they didn't have anywhere to go that night. They didn't know where they were going to be living from place to place. And I started thinking, wow, this is not good. You know, these kids don't really have a place to go. There was a pregnant youth in my classroom, and she was not settled or stable. Even though she was in the program, there was still a lot of extra factors that was very detrimental to these youth. I mean, I could kind of relate to what some of them were going through. Being a teen mother myself, you know, I didn't want to see the students and the young women go through some of the same things that I had gone through as a teenager. Not that I was in foster care, but still that age group of going from adulthood, from teenagehood to adulthood. So I started